He almost signed away his future until a child's crayon drawing revealed the betrayal in his own home. What she uncovered would expose the two people he trusted most. The afternoon sun slanted across the wide marble steps of Nathan Cole's mansion when the courier appeared at the door. Nathan had not been expecting visitors, yet the man stood there with a crisp uniform and a leather satchel, holding out an envelope as if it contained the most important news in the world. Nathan signed without thinking, his mind still half on the call he had just ended, a discussion about firewalls and system updates, the kind of problems that had made him a millionaire before he turned 35. He turned the envelope over in his hands, and something about it unsettled him. The paper was heavy, thicker than normal, and the seal was blank. No company logo, no sender's name, just a dark wax circle pressed flat, as though whoever had closed it wanted to hide rather than be recognized. Nathan carried it inside, setting it down on the polished mahogany table in his foyer. For a moment he stared at it, wondering who would send something so old-fashioned. Most of his work arrived through encrypted servers or secure apps, never by hand. He had grown used to speed and precision, contracts delivered digitally within seconds. But here was this envelope, strangely out of place in his world of technology and security. His fingers tapped the table, part of him curious to break it open, part of him reluctant, as if some instinct told him not to. From the hallway, Sophie watched in silence. She had been with Nathan only a few months, a 9-year-old foster girl who had learned in her short life that sometimes it was better to stay quiet and observe. She noticed things others overlooked, the slight shift in someone's expression, the way a voice changed when a lie passed through it. Now her eyes were locked on the envelope, her small hands gripping the doorframe. To her it did not look like an invitation to opportunity, but like a threat dressed in fancy paper. Nathan finally lifted the envelope, holding it to the light. He could see faint marks beneath the wax, as if several fingers had pressed it again and again. He thought of Marcus Levin, his CFO, always pushing him toward new deals, and of Sabrina, his elegant fiancée, who often encouraged him to take risks in the name of growth. Perhaps it was from one of them, though why send it this way? He frowned, uneasy, though he could not say why. He caught sight of Sophie then, her dark eyes following his every move. She did not say a word, but her gaze held a warning, an urgency far beyond her years. Nathan, for reasons he did not understand, felt a chill crawl up his spine. He smiled at her faintly, trying to reassure her, but when he looked back down at the envelope, the smile faded. The weight of it in his hand felt unnatural, too heavy for a simple letter. He set it back down without opening it, telling himself he would deal with it later. Yet as he walked away, he could not shake the feeling that Sophie's silent watchfulness meant something, that perhaps she had seen the truth before he was willing to admit it. Nathan sat at his desk, the envelope resting on the polished wood like a puzzle he could not quite solve. The late afternoon light caught the edges, making the wax seal shine darkly against the thick parchment. He tapped his pen against the arm of his chair, telling himself he was being ridiculous. It was only paper, only a message, nothing that could harm him. Yet he kept glancing at it as if it were alive. The silence of the study stretched, filled only with the low hum of the computer and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Sophie lingered in the doorway, her small figure half hidden in the shadows. She had been standing there for several minutes, watching the way Nathan studied the envelope, but did not open it. Her time in foster care had taught her things most children her age never learned. Things about when to keep quiet and when to speak, when to trust her instincts and when to stay invisible. She noticed the tiny details. The way the ink smudges on the front were too perfect, as if someone had pressed a finger there on purpose. The way the handwriting seemed careful to hide something in its neatness. To her, the envelope did not look like an opportunity. It looked like bait. She took a step closer, her sneakers silent against the rug, and tugged gently at Nathan's sleeve. He looked down, surprised, and gave her a distracted smile, his mind still fixed on the sealed paper. "What is it, Sophie?" he asked softly, already half expecting her to ask about dinner or homework. But her eyes never left the envelope. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper, the kind of voice meant only for him. "That envelope is a trap." Nathan froze, his pen pausing mid-tap. He blinked at her, almost amused, almost ready to laugh off her words as childish imagination. "A trap?" he repeated, the corners of his mouth tugging upward as if he wanted to make light of it. Yet the look in her eyes stopped him. Brown and steady, they carried none of the playful exaggeration of a child making up stories. They carried experience, the hard-earned certainty of someone who had already seen too much for her age. For a moment he tried to brush it aside, telling himself she was being dramatic, that her past had made her suspicious of everything. But as he met her gaze, he felt something shift inside him. She was not guessing. She was not pretending. She believed it. And the way she looked at him, unwavering and almost pleading, unsettled him in a way no business rival ever had. He looked back at the envelope and suddenly saw what she meant. The smudges that seemed placed too neatly, the weight of the paper that felt heavier than it should, the emptiness of the seal that revealed nothing. He forced a laugh, more to comfort himself than her, and ruffled her hair gently. "You've been watching too many spy movies," he said, his voice light. But his hand lingered on the envelope without opening it, his chest tight with unease. Sophie stepped back, her silence louder than any argument, and he found himself unable to shake the echo of her whisper. Nathan finally broke the wax seal and slid the thick papers out, the weight of them resting heavy in his hands. The text was printed in flawless lines, the language smooth and persuasive, speaking of partnerships across the ocean, markets waiting to be opened, profits beyond anything his company had ever touched. The numbers made his head spin, the kind of figures that could change the entire industry overnight. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he read, the corners of his mouth tightening with both fascination and doubt. The deal promised billions in expansion, access to clients who had previously shut their doors, and the kind of influence he had dreamed of back when he was still a 20-year-old coding in a rented apartment with nothing but ambition to keep him awake. Marcus Levin arrived not long after, crisp in his tailored suit, carrying himself with the assurance of a man who believed he had already won. He had been with Nathan since the beginning, guiding numbers while Nathan guided code, and over time his voice had become one Nathan trusted in financial matters. Now Marcus's eyes gleamed as he glanced at the documents spread across the desk. "This is it," he said, his tone low and urgent. "This is the deal that will take us global. No more small contracts, no more fighting for scraps of market share. Billions, Nathan, and all we have to do is sign." Nathan studied him carefully. Marcus rarely showed excitement, but now his enthusiasm seemed too polished, too rehearsed, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. Nathan tapped the edge of the paper with his finger, not speaking right away. Sophie lingered by the door again, her small frame half hidden behind the wood, her wide eyes never leaving the envelope or the pages now lying open on the desk. To her, the shiny numbers and promises of wealth looked less like opportunity and more like bait laid out in a trap. She shifted her weight, hugging her arms to her chest, her gaze sharp and watchful. Marcus leaned closer, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves might be listening. "I know you're cautious, Nathan, but this is different. These people have resources beyond anything we've dealt with. They can guarantee protection, secure passage into markets that usually take years to break into. They're offering you a seat at the table with the biggest players in the world. Don't hesitate. We can't afford to lose this chance." Nathan nodded slowly, but unease slid through him like a shadow. He had spent his life measuring risks, building his empire not only with vision but with careful steps. Something about Marcus's urgency, about the way he almost pushed the words into Nathan's ears, felt wrong. He glanced again at Sophie, standing silently, her eyes locked on him as though she could see past the glittering numbers into something darker. She didn't say anything this time, but her expression said enough. Nathan felt the weight of her earlier whisper pressing at him still. The envelope promised wealth beyond imagining, yet the certainty in a child's eyes made him wonder what kind of price might come hidden inside. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows of the study, laying silver shadows across the bookshelves and the wide desk where the envelope still rested. Sophie moved silently, her small figure blending into the stillness of the night. She had learned long ago how to walk without sound, how to breathe without being noticed. Tonight she carried a scrap of paper folded in her hand, her heart beating fast, though she could not have said whether it was from fear or determination. She approached Nathan's desk, the leather chair pushed back slightly from when he had left hours earlier. The envelope lay there like something waiting, its seal now broken, the papers spread beneath it. Sophie did not touch them. Instead, she unfolded her note and set it gently on top. The words were written in her careful, uneven handwriting, the kind of writing that showed how seriously she had thought about every letter. Don't trust Marcus. Don't open things he gives you. She hesitated a moment, staring at the words, wondering if Nathan would even believe her. Adults rarely believe children, and she had been dismissed too many times before, but something inside her told her she had to try, even if it meant he laughed or grew angry. When she slipped out of the study, the house remained silent, unaware that a 9-year-old girl had just left behind a warning that might change everything. She went back to her room and curled beneath the blankets, her eyes open to the ceiling. She could still see Marcus's polished smile in her mind, the way his voice always sounded like it was rehearsed, the way he carried himself as if the world owed him more. She had seen men like that before, in different homes, wearing different faces. They always wanted something, and they always found ways to take it. She whispered a small prayer to herself, not sure who might be listening, but hoping Nathan would take her words seriously. Morning came with sunlight streaming across the mansion's polished floors. Nathan walked into his study with a cup of coffee, his mind already running through numbers and meetings. He reached for the stack of papers on his desk, but his hand stopped when he saw the small folded note sitting on top. He opened it slowly, his brows furrowing as he read the uneven letters. The words were simple, but they struck him harder than any boardroom argument could. Don't trust Marcus. Don't open things he gives you. A strange chill moved through him, one he could not easily explain. Marcus had been by his side for years, more than an employee, closer to a brother. The thought that a child who had known him only months could suspect him of betrayal felt absurd. And yet Nathan found himself staring at the note, his fingers tightening around it. Why would Sophie write this? What had she seen that he had not? He sat down slowly, the note still in his hand, and felt a thread of doubt begin to weave itself through the loyalty he thought was unshakable. Nathan sat in his office with the papers spread in front of him, the envelope torn open, but its contents still untouched. The numbers danced on the page, promising a future most men would sell their souls for, but his eyes kept drifting away from the figures to the memory of Sophie's small note in her uneven handwriting. Don't trust Marcus. Don't open things he gives you. At first he had wanted to dismiss it as the product of a child's anxious imagination. Yet as the hours passed, he found the words returning to him, unsettling his thoughts. When Marcus came by later that morning, his energy was restless, his words urgent. He spoke quickly, emphasizing how time was running out, how competitors would seize the opportunity if they did not act now, how Nathan needed to sign before the week was out. Nathan listened carefully, his expression calm, but each time he asked a question, Marcus seemed to sidestep. When Nathan inquired about the background of the overseas investors, Marcus gave vague reassurances. When he pressed about the terms of security, Marcus changed the subject to profits and influence. His answers felt polished, almost memorized, like a script recited for an audience. After Marcus left, Nathan poured himself a glass of water and stared at his reflection in the tall window. Doubt gnawed at him. Marcus had been by his side for years, through victories and near disasters. He had always trusted him with numbers, with contracts, with details Nathan himself often overlooked. But something now felt wrong. It was in the way Marcus avoided his eyes when questions cut too close, the way his insistence grew sharper whenever Nathan hesitated, as if pushing him to act quickly before he had time to think. Sabrina appeared in the doorway that evening, radiant in a silk dress that caught the light. She crossed the room with the grace that had captivated him since the first night they met. Sitting on the edge of his desk, she smoothed her hand over his shoulder and asked what troubled him. Nathan mentioned the deal, his uncertainty, the way Marcus had been pressing so hard. Sabrina's laughter was soft, almost musical, as she tilted her head and assured him he was overthinking. Marcus was loyal, she said. He had always been loyal. He had built everything beside Nathan and would never risk it. Her eyes were warm and persuasive, yet Nathan felt the weight of her certainty push against his own doubts, urging him toward a conclusion he was not ready to accept. He tried to smile, to let her reassurance sink in, but when she left the room, he glanced again at the envelope. Sophie's whisper returned to him with startling clarity. That envelope is a trap. He could still see her serious eyes fixed on it, a gaze unshaken by wealth or charm or promises. He rubbed his temples, torn between loyalty to the people who had stood by him and the unsettling warning of a child who had nothing to gain and everything to fear. The study smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee when Josephine Chan entered with her feather duster tucked under one arm. She had been with the Cole family for decades, keeping the house in order with a quiet efficiency Nathan had always admired. That morning she moved between the shelves, humming under her breath, dusting frames and shifting stacks of books the way she always did. Nathan sat at his desk, still staring at the envelope that had unsettled him since its arrival. Sophie lingered in the doorway as if drawn there by some invisible string, her eyes never leaving the desk. Josephine reached for a vase on the side table, her sleeve brushing the edge of the envelope. It slipped from the desk and fluttered to the carpet, landing with a dull thud that made Nathan lift his head. For a moment it was nothing, just paper falling. Then he caught a faint, sharp smell, out of place in his quiet study. Not the smell of ink or parchment, but something chemical, like the sting of solvents or the bitter edge of burned wiring. His pulse jumped. He stood quickly, crossing to where the envelope lay. Josephine apologized, bending to pick it up, but Nathan stopped her with a raised hand. He crouched himself, staring at it closely. His instincts, honed from years of dealing with threats in business, told him this was not ordinary. He reached for it carefully, bringing it to his nose, and there it was again, that acrid scent that did not belong. He set it back on the desk with deliberate care, his mind racing through possibilities. Hidden ink designed to smear, powders meant to trigger sensors, even devices that could compromise a system once opened. He had seen things like this during security briefings, threats most people dismissed as stories, but he knew they were real. Sophie stood very still in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her. She did not say a word, but Nathan felt her watching him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Her earlier whisper echoed in his mind. That envelope is a trap. At the time he had smiled, half amused, half dismissive, but now the memory cut through him with startling clarity. He looked up at Josephine, who had paused mid-dust, her eyes on him, waiting for explanation. "It's fine," he said, though his voice was quieter than usual. He could not bring himself to tell her what he suspected, not yet, not until he understood it better. Instead, he turned the envelope over in his hands, studying the seal and the paper. On the surface it was nothing, just contracts promising wealth. Yet the smell told him otherwise. Someone wanted him to open it without question, to sign quickly and move on. Someone wanted to use his trust against him. Sophie shifted, her gaze locked on his face. She was waiting, Nathan realized, waiting for him to see what she had already known. Slowly, he set the envelope aside, not in the drawer with his other files, but away from the desk entirely, as if even its presence among his papers could do harm. He forced a steady breath, his instincts sharpened now in a way they had not been before. The trap was no longer hidden. He could sense its edges, waiting to snap closed. Nathan sat in his study long after the house had gone quiet, the faint hum of electronics and the steady tick of the clock the only sounds around him. The envelope lay untouched on the far corner of the desk, its faint chemical odor still sharp in his memory. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts turning over one another like gears grinding in an overworked machine. Sophie's whisper echoed again in his head, her warning that the envelope was a trap. Now, with the evidence of that acrid smell and the unease twisting in his chest, he could no longer dismiss her words as childish worry. He thought back to the last few months, to moments he had overlooked at the time, but now stood out in stark detail. There were files that had gone missing from his office, small things at first, drafts of proposals, early blueprints for a program he had been developing. He had assumed they were misplaced in the shuffle of late nights and overwork, but later those same ideas appeared in the hands of competitors. His lawyers had told him such overlaps happened often in the tech world, that coincidences were inevitable. But Nathan had always prided himself on being careful, on guarding his innovations. The coincidences had piled higher than he wanted to admit. Then there were the meetings that seemed compromised before they even began. He would walk into a pitch with what he believed was a fresh angle, only to find the rival firm already prepared with counters to every detail, as though they had read his notes themselves. Each time Marcus had explained it away, insisting rivals had scouts, that leaks were part of doing business. Nathan had wanted to believe him. After all, Marcus had been by his side for years, building the company from the ground up. Loyalty had been their foundation, or so Nathan thought. And then there was Sabrina. Elegant, poised, always at his side with a reassuring smile. She told him Marcus was trustworthy, told him not to let doubt poison what they had built. Yet he remembered nights when she arrived at his office unexpectedly, asking too many questions about schedules and strategies, offering comfort that seemed perfectly timed. He recalled her insistence that beauty and charm could soften the stress of his work, her gifts of art and decoration for his study, small tokens that placed her in his private space more often than he realized. Nathan rubbed his temples, trying to put the pieces together. The envelope was not just an offer. It was bait, laid carefully for him to step into. But who had set it there? Marcus, with his sharp push for quick decisions and vague answers? Or Sabrina, with her careful blend of affection and intrusion? Or perhaps it was someone else entirely, someone hiding in the background, using those closest to him as pawns. He looked toward the door, where Sophie had stood so often with her quiet eyes, seeing truths he had ignored. A child with no power, yet somehow she had seen more clearly than the adults he trusted most. Nathan folded his hands on the desk and took a steady breath. The patterns of betrayal were beginning to emerge, and he knew he could no longer ignore them. Nathan was in the library when Sophie came to him, her small footsteps soft against the carpet, her hands clutching a worn notebook she treated as if it were made of glass. He glanced up from the stack of reports spread across the table, his mind still tangled in doubts about Marcus and Sabrina, but the seriousness on her face made him set the papers aside. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she walked over slowly, holding the notebook close to her chest like a secret she had carried for too long. Nathan leaned forward, sensing something important, and waited. With a careful motion, Sophie placed the notebook on the table and opened it. The pages were filled with uneven handwriting, crooked lines, and sketches that looked more like doodles than anything useful at first glance. Nathan frowned slightly, unsure what he was looking at, until Sophie spoke in her quiet but steady voice. "These are my treasures," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I watch people. I write down what I see. It helps me remember what's true." Nathan turned the pages slowly, and with each one, his heart tightened. There was a drawing of the front gate with Sabrina standing beside it, her long hair scribbled in dark pencil strokes. Next to her was a figure Nathan didn't recognize, drawn tall with a hat pulled low, and above them she had written in shaky letters, "She gives him papers." He flipped to another page and found a sketch of Marcus in the study, a phone pressed to his ear, the words, "late night calls," "angry voice," scrawled underneath. On yet another page, Sophie had drawn an envelope, almost identical to the one sitting unopened on Nathan's desk, and beside it she had written, "He gives her one when you are gone." The childish drawings should have been easy to dismiss, but Nathan felt the weight of them as if they were photographs. He saw in Sophie's careful notes the survival instincts of a child who had spent years learning to watch for danger, to notice what others overlooked. She had been gathering intelligence without knowing the word for it, piecing together a pattern of behavior that suddenly made his own suspicions sharper. His hand lingered on one page where Sophie had drawn the outline of Sabrina's face with her unmistakable smile, but Sophie had shaded her eyes dark, almost black, with the words "smiles but not real" written beneath. Nathan's chest ached at the sight. He thought of the night Sabrina had soothed his doubts, her laughter warm, her reassurances constant. Now he wondered if all of it had been another mask. Sophie watched him closely, her small hands twisting together as if afraid he might dismiss her again. "I thought maybe you wouldn't believe me," she whispered. "But I saw it. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget." Nathan closed the notebook gently and placed his hand over hers. "I believe you," he said, and the words carried more weight than he expected. He realized this child, quiet and watchful, had been protecting him in ways he had not even thought possible. The evidence was not typed on legal paper or sealed with corporate stamps, but it was real, and it was enough to make him see that betrayal lived inside his own home. The fire crackled softly in the grand stone fireplace, its glow painting the study in flickering shades of orange and gold. Nathan stood before it with the envelope in his hand, the weight of it pressing heavier than paper should. Sophie sat curled in a chair near the wall, her notebook tucked protectively in her lap, her watchful eyes fixed on him as if willing him to see what she had already known. Josephine stood nearby, her hands folded neatly though her face carried quiet concern. The house had grown thick with tension, every shadow seeming sharper, every silence stretching longer. Marcus had arrived earlier, full of his usual confidence, speaking quickly of deadlines and golden opportunities, his voice urgent and rehearsed. Sabrina followed soon after, her presence smooth and graceful, her beauty like a shield she wielded without effort. Together they filled the study, pressing their certainty onto Nathan, urging him to sign, to seize the deal before it slipped away. But the envelope in his hand smelled faintly of chemicals, the papers carried the echo of Sophie's drawings, and Josephine's quiet words of caution rang in his ears. He looked from Marcus to Sabrina, then down to Sophie. Her gaze did not waver, her small frame tense, her lips pressed together in silence. When he moved toward the fireplace, Marcus blinked in surprise, his usual composure slipping for the first time. Sabrina let out a light laugh, though it trembled at the edges, and asked what he was doing. Nathan said nothing. He crouched slightly, holding the envelope above the flames. For a brief moment he hesitated, the promise of wealth and expansion whispering from the papers inside, the temptation of billions waiting just beyond his grasp. Then Sophie's whisper echoed in his mind again, that small but certain voice declaring, "That envelope is a trap." Without another thought, he let it fall. The paper curled instantly, the wax seal melting, the edges blackening as the flames consumed it. A faint hiss rose as the chemical odor grew sharper, proof that this was never ordinary paper. Sabrina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in feigned shock, though Nathan saw the calculation flicker across her eyes. Marcus paled, his confident posture sagging as though the fire had stolen the strength from his body. Sophie exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours, her shoulders easing. She leaned forward, her voice low but clear, carrying across the crackle of the fire. "You believed me." The relief in her tone cut through Nathan's chest. He looked at her and saw not just a child, but the one person who had trusted her instincts when no one else had. He nodded slowly, feeling the truth settle in him with a weight heavier than any fortune. The flames died down, leaving only blackened ash where the promise of billions once lay. Nathan turned back to the faces in the room. Marcus avoided his eyes, Sabrina forced a smile, and Josephine stood steady as always. Nathan realized in that moment that trust was no longer a word he could hand out freely. It had to be earned, and Sophie, with her quiet voice and sharp eyes, had just proven she saw clearer than all of them. The ashes in the fireplace still glowed faintly when the storm broke. Marcus's voice rose first, sharp with disbelief and anger, his polished calm stripped away as he stepped toward Nathan with wide eyes. He insisted Nathan had just destroyed the most important deal of their lives, shouting that billions had gone up in flames because of a reckless choice. His words rattled the walls, his hands gesturing wildly, no longer the smooth and calculated man Nathan had relied on for years, but someone frantic and desperate, as though his entire future had just slipped through his fingers. Sabrina's reaction came next, her voice soft at first but cutting like glass. She accused Nathan of being paranoid, of letting his imagination run wild, of listening to whispers from a child who barely knew him. She tilted her head, her expression wounded as if she were the one betrayed. Her words poured out like honey laced with venom, each sentence meant to sting while wrapping itself in the guise of love. She told him he was throwing away their future together, that his fear was ruining everything they had built. Yet her eyes betrayed her, flashing with something cold beneath the polished mask. Nathan stood still in the center of the storm, his shoulders steady, his gaze fixed not on Marcus or Sabrina, but on the ashes in the fireplace. The crackle of dying flames sounded louder than their accusations. In that moment, clarity swept over him like a tide. The moment the paper curled into blackened ash, so too had the illusions that had bound him. Marcus's loyalty, Sabrina's devotion, all of it had been smoke and mirrors. The anger and accusations now spilling from their lips were not the cries of betrayed allies, but the desperate thrashings of people whose schemes had just been exposed. Josephine remained quiet at the edge of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes following the unfolding scene with a calm that carried more weight than any shouted word. Sophie sat on the arm of a chair, her knees pulled close, her gaze steady on Nathan. She had no need to speak. Her small whisper had already proven truer than all of Marcus's promises and Sabrina's reassurances. Nathan lifted his head slowly, meeting Marcus's furious stare, and then Sabrina's sharpened glare. He said nothing, letting the silence speak louder than arguments. For years he had listened to Marcus's counsel, trusted Sabrina's comfort, relied on their presence in his life. Now he saw them clearly for the first time. Their loyalty had always been conditional, their devotion tied to what they stood to gain. The chaos swirled around him, but Nathan felt strangely calm. He knew he had not ruined a billion-dollar opportunity. He had destroyed a trap, and in doing so revealed the truth about those closest to him. Wealth could be rebuilt, deals could be remade, but trust, once shattered, could never be restored. Sophie's quiet whisper had saved him from more than financial ruin. It had stripped away the masks worn by the people he thought he knew best. The argument between Marcus and Sabrina still echoed faintly in Nathan's ears when Sophie tugged at his sleeve. She waited until the study was empty, until Josephine had quietly guided the others out with the calm authority of someone who knew when silence mattered more than words. Nathan's jaw was tight, his chest still heavy from the weight of betrayal, but when Sophie looked up at him with those serious brown eyes, he felt his focus shift. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she held his hand, guiding him across the room to the far corner where the air vent sat low against the wall. Nathan frowned, confusion flickering across his face. He had walked past that vent every day without thought. But Sophie knelt down, her small fingers prying carefully at the screws that had already been loosened. She glanced back at him, her expression cautious, then pulled free the metal cover and reached inside. From the dark cavity, she drew out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She placed it on the floor between them and unfolded it with slow, deliberate care. Nathan's breath caught when he saw what lay inside. Tiny microchips gleamed under the lamplight, each one delicate but unmistakable, the kind used in advanced surveillance equipment. There were documents, too, folded neatly, bearing his own company's letterhead, but not in his handwriting. The signatures looked eerily like his, forged with precision. And there, at the bottom of the bundle, were recording devices, sleek and modern, designed to capture both audio and video without detection. For a long moment Nathan could not move. His hands tightened into fists at his sides as the truth sank in. Someone had planted these things in his home. Someone had been preparing to destroy him, not from the outside, but from within his own walls. He looked at Sophie, who sat very still, watching his reaction, and realized she had known this for days. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. "I found it when I couldn't sleep," she admitted, her fingers tracing the edge of one document. "I thought maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just imagining things again. But then the envelope came, and I knew it was connected. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid you wouldn't believe me." Nathan's throat tightened. He knelt beside her, picking up one of the forged documents and turning it over slowly. The fake signature stared back at him, mocking in its familiarity. He thought of the missing files, the strange coincidences, the sudden pressure to sign deals he didn't fully understand. It all connected now. The envelope was only the beginning. The real trap was deeper, woven into his life, hidden in vents and tucked behind trusted faces. He looked back at Sophie, who had risked his anger by prying open vents, by keeping notes, by daring to speak truths no one else wanted to hear. "You saved me," he said softly, and he meant it. The evidence before him was proof, undeniable and dangerous, that someone had turned his own home into a weapon against him. Nathan found Marcus in the lounge the next evening, sipping whiskey from a crystal glass as if nothing in the world could disturb his calm. The sight tightened something in Nathan's chest. He had built so much of his empire with Marcus at his side, trusted him to guard the numbers while he focused on the code, and yet the bundle Sophie had revealed from the vent made it impossible to ignore the truth any longer. Nathan closed the door behind him, the soft click loud in the silence. Marcus looked up, his usual polished smile curving across his face, but Nathan noticed the flicker of unease in his eyes. "I want to know what you've been doing," Nathan said, his voice low but steady. He didn't sit. He stood across from Marcus, the firelight from the hearth flickering between them like a line drawn in the sand. Marcus swirled the amber liquid in his glass, forcing a chuckle that carried no warmth. "You'll have to be more specific. I do many things for this company. Too many, if you ask me." Nathan dropped the forged document on the table between them. The signature, a near-perfect copy of his own, stared up at them. "This was in my house," he said. "In a vent. Along with recording devices. Along with chips someone planted to monitor me. Don't play games, Marcus. I want the truth." The mask slipped then, just a little, enough for Nathan to see the bitterness etched beneath the charm. Marcus set his glass down with deliberate care and leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Do you know what it's like to build something with someone, to give everything, and watch the world only see him? Do you know what it's like to be the shadow, while you get all the credit?" His voice had hardened, the edge of envy cutting through every word. Nathan felt the blow land deeper than expected. He had always thought of Marcus as an equal, the other half of the company's foundation, the man who balanced his vision with structure. To hear the bitterness now, laid bare, was like discovering rot in the beams of a house he thought solid. "So you fed them information," Nathan said, the weight of it heavy on his tongue. Marcus gave a small, sharp smile. "Competitors pay well for details, timelines, proposals, nothing you couldn't recover from, nothing that would sink us. I took what I was owed. I deserve more than scraps while you play the genius and soak in the praise." Nathan's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You betrayed everything we built." Marcus shrugged, his bitterness plain now. "I never touched that envelope. I don't know what trap you think you've avoided, but that wasn't me. I may have bent the rules, but I wouldn't be stupid enough to deliver your ruin." The denial rang half true, half false, but Nathan's chest tightened all the same. The betrayal was enough, even without the envelope. The man he had trusted most had sold pieces of their future, not out of necessity, but out of envy. Nathan turned from the fire, the sting of Marcus's words echoing in his mind, and felt a hollowness he had not known before. The night felt heavier than most, the air thick with betrayal after Marcus had been escorted from the mansion under Josephine's watchful eye. Nathan remained in the study, staring into the fire as the crackling logs spat sparks. His chest felt hollow, a strange mixture of anger and grief pressing inside him. Marcus had been his closest ally, the man who helped turn an idea into an empire. Yet envy had poisoned him until all that remained was bitterness. Nathan pressed a hand against his temple, wishing for silence in his thoughts, but they roared on restlessly. The door opened softly and Sabrina slipped inside, her presence bringing with it the faint perfume he had always found comforting. She crossed the room with careful grace, her silk dress brushing against the rug, her movements calculated but tender. She sat on the arm of his chair, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as if to steady him. "You've had a hard night," she whispered, her voice smooth, warm, practiced. "I can't imagine how this must feel for you, to be betrayed like that." Nathan exhaled, letting her fingers brush against his jaw. Her touch had always been a balm, a distraction from the harshness of his work. She leaned closer, her hair falling against his cheek, her lips brushing his temple as she murmured words of comfort. "But you still have me. You still have us. We'll get through this together." Her smile shone as she pulled back, a smile polished and flawless, the kind that had captivated him since the beginning. For a moment he let himself believe it, let the comfort seep into his bruised pride. Then Sophie appeared in the doorway, her small frame lit by the hallway lamp behind her. She stood silently for a long moment, watching the scene, her notebook hugged to her chest. Nathan noticed her eyes, not soft or uncertain, but steady and sharp. She stepped forward, tugged gently at his sleeve, and leaned in close enough that only he could hear her words. "She's worse." The whisper cut through him like a blade. He turned his head, startled, but Sophie's gaze did not waver. Her brown eyes held none of the fear he had seen when she first came to live with him. Instead, they carried a certainty that made his stomach twist. She had been right about the envelope, right about Marcus, and now she was looking at Sabrina with the same unshaken clarity. Nathan's first instinct was to dismiss it. He wanted to believe in Sabrina, wanted to hold on to the warmth she offered, the beauty and charm that had wrapped around his lonely life. He wanted to believe in love, in partnership, in the future he had imagined with her. But as he looked into Sophie's eyes, unwavering and unblinking, doubt crawled into him. He glanced back at Sabrina, still smiling, her hand resting lightly against his arm. For the first time, that smile no longer felt like comfort. It felt like a mask, one that might slip if he stared too long. And for the first time, Nathan wondered if the woman he planned to marry was part of the very trap that threatened to ruin him. The morning sun spilled across the marble floors of the library when Josephine entered, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp with the weight of something she had uncovered. Nathan sat at the long oak table, his hands folded, his mind still heavy with Sophie's whisper from the night before. Sabrina stood near the window, sipping tea from a porcelain cup, her presence radiant as always, her smile polished and effortless. Sophie sat quietly in a chair, her notebook resting in her lap, her gaze moving from one adult to the other, as though she already knew what was coming. Josephine set a small device on the table and pressed a button. The screen lit up, showing grainy black and white footage from the estate's security system. Nathan leaned forward, his breath catching as the images flickered into view. It was his study, unmistakable with its tall shelves and heavy desk. The timestamp glowed in the corner, marking the night before the envelope had been delivered. At first the room appeared empty, then the door opened slowly, and Sabrina slipped inside. She moved with careful steps, her hair tied back, her hands gloved. Nathan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as he watched her cross to his desk. She did not pause or hesitate as though she had done it before. From her purse, she pulled out a slim package wrapped in plain paper. She placed it neatly on the desk, her movements precise, deliberate. She stood still for a moment, glancing around as if making sure nothing was out of place, then she left as quietly as she had come. Nathan could not tear his eyes from the screen. His hands clenched against the table, his chest tightening with disbelief and betrayal. The silence in the room grew heavy, pressing down like a storm about to break. He looked at Sabrina, searching her face for denial, for shock, for anything that would tell him the footage was false. But she only smiled. It was not the warm smile that had once disarmed him, not the gentle smile that had soothed him in late hours of doubt. It was sharp and cool, a smile that carried no love at all. She set her teacup down with steady hands and met his gaze without flinching. "So you found out," she said simply, her tone calm, almost amused. "I wondered how long it would take." Nathan's throat felt dry. "Why?" The word was raw, scraped from deep inside. Sabrina tilted her head, her eyes glinting. "Because I never loved you. Not once. What I loved was the fortune you guarded so carefully, the secrets you tried to keep locked in files and systems, the empire you thought no one could touch. You were never the prize, Nathan. What you owned was." Sophie's small gasp filled the silence, but Nathan barely heard it. His world tilted, the truth cutting deeper than Marcus's betrayal ever had. Sabrina had been in his home, in his heart, planning his destruction with the same smile he once believed was love. Nathan's world seemed to tilt as Sabrina's smile lingered in the air, sharp and cold. He had spent months imagining her as the answer to his loneliness, the partner who would steady his restless nights, but now he saw her clearly for what she was. The silence in the library stretched until even the faint hum of the security device on the table sounded loud. Sabrina leaned back against the window, her posture relaxed as if she were not standing in the ruins of his trust, but in a stage she had always prepared for. "You want the truth," she said softly, her voice carrying the same warmth she used to charm him, though now it rang hollow. "Fine. I worked with Marcus long before you even noticed me. We planned this together. He knew your weaknesses. I knew how to become what you wanted. He gave me the details of your routines, your habits, the kind of woman you trusted most. And I became her." She spread her hands, almost laughing at the simplicity of it. "It wasn't difficult. Men like you never see past the smile." Nathan's jaw tightened. He wanted to deny it, to tell himself she was lying to cover Marcus's betrayal, but her calmness left no room for doubt. Sophie sat very still on the chair, her wide eyes focused on Sabrina with both fear and defiance. Josephine moved closer to Nathan, her quiet presence steadying him, though he barely felt it through the storm that raged inside. Sabrina walked slowly to the table, her heels clicking softly on the floor, and tapped her manicured nail against the security footage still paused on the screen. The envelope wasn't an opportunity. It was the last piece of the plan, a perfect proposal, all the right words, all the right numbers, designed so you couldn't resist. But inside were documents, signatures, bank accounts, all tied to you. The moment you opened it, the moment you signed anything connected to it, you would be implicated in corporate espionage. Every deal you've ever made would be questioned, every client would turn on you, and the government would come knocking. The words landed like blows. Nathan felt his stomach knot, his vision narrowing as he pictured himself handcuffed, his company stripped, his name dragged through headlines not as a visionary, but as a criminal. He thought of all the late nights building firewalls and code, all the years of sacrifice, all the risks he took to prove himself, and how easily it could have been erased with the stroke of a pen on poisoned paper. Sabrina smiled again, a smile that no longer pretended to love. You see, it was never about just money. It was about control. Marcus wanted recognition. I wanted access. Together we would have taken everything from you while you were too blinded by loyalty and affection to notice. Nathan's hands tightened around the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. He looked at Sophie, who whispered so softly he barely heard, "I told you." And in that whisper came the crushing truth. Sabrina's love had been an illusion, Marcus's loyalty a lie, and the envelope the blade they meant to cut his life apart. The sound of Sabrina's heels striking the marble echoed like gunfire through the hall as she moved quickly toward the front door. Nathan called after her, his voice steady but edged with disbelief, yet she didn't slow. She paused only long enough to glance back, her green eyes bright with a strange mixture of triumph and disdain. "You'll never prove all of it," she said, her smile as sharp as glass. Then she slipped out into the night, the door closing with a soft thud that seemed louder than any slam. Nathan stood frozen, his hands still clenched, watching as the woman he had once thought he would marry vanished into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal. Marcus was not so quick. He sat slumped in a chair by the fire, his arrogance gone, his face pale and hollow in the glow of the embers. Josephine had called the authorities with quiet efficiency, and though Marcus tried to protest, his voice carried no power anymore. His earlier anger had drained into resignation. He knew the walls were closing in, and there was nowhere left for him to run. Nathan looked at him, this man who had stood beside him for years, who had shared victories and defeats, and felt only a dull ache. Betrayal from an enemy was one thing. Betrayal from a brother was something else entirely. Sophie moved closer to him, her notebook pressed against her chest. She didn't speak, but her eyes were steady, and Nathan saw in them a strength he had been blind to before. She had whispered the truth when he hadn't wanted to hear it. She had noticed the signs he had ignored. And when the weight of lies threatened to bury him, she had stood firm. Josephine, too, stood at his side, her presence calm and unshaken. She had been in his family's service since before he had built his empire, keeping the house in order, watching quietly when others had taken center stage. Tonight, both she and Sophie had proven themselves not as background figures, but as his truest allies. Nathan turned his gaze to the fireplace. The ashes of the envelope lay gray and brittle among the embers, the last remnants of the trap that had nearly destroyed him. He stared at them, realizing the flames had consumed not just paper, but illusions. His executives, his fiancée, the carefully polished circle of loyalty he thought surrounded him, all had crumbled into lies and ambition. What remained were the people he had least expected, a child who had once been afraid to speak, and a caretaker who had never sought recognition. For the first time in years, Nathan felt clarity. Wealth and power had never protected him. It was trust that had been his greatest safeguard, and trust had not come from the ones who wore tailored suits or dazzling smiles. It had come from the small, watchful girl who whispered warnings in the dark, and the quiet woman who had stood by his family for decades without faltering. As the distant sound of sirens approached, Nathan placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder and another on Josephine's arm. "You saved me," he said simply. And in that moment, he knew the truth. The people who mattered most were not the ones he once placed on pedestals, but the ones who had stood in the shadows, steady and unseen, until he finally opened his eyes. The weeks that followed were heavy with consequences, yet they carried a sense of strange calm as well. Marcus was taken into custody, his name splashed across newspapers and business columns, no longer praised as a financial genius, but condemned as a man who sold secrets and betrayed his partner. Nathan read the headlines without satisfaction, only a quiet ache in his chest. Marcus had once been the closest thing he had to family, but now he was just another cautionary story about envy and greed. Sabrina's trail grew cold almost immediately. Reports surfaced of her boarding a private jet with forged documents, and then nothing. She vanished into the wide world, leaving only the ghost of her smile behind, a smile that Nathan now recognized had never belonged to him. The mansion felt different in her absence, no longer carrying the perfume of deception or the sharp edge of pretense. At first, Nathan had feared it would feel empty, but slowly it began to fill with something new. Sophie's presence grew stronger, her voice more certain, her laughter more frequent. Where once she hovered quietly at the edges of rooms, now she moved freely, taping her colorful drawings to the walls of hallways and stairwells. Bright crayon landscapes and stick figure families replaced the cold, abstract paintings Sabrina had once insisted upon. Each picture made the house warmer, more alive, and Nathan found himself smiling each time he passed them. Josephine's laughter returned to the kitchen, the sound rich and familiar, reminding Nathan of simpler times when his parents were still alive and the house had felt like a true home. She baked more often now, filling the air with the comforting scent of bread and spices, and Sophie would sit on a stool beside her, sketching at the counter or stealing tastes of dough. Nathan sometimes stood in the doorway, watching them with a quiet awe, realizing that these small, ordinary moments were worth more than any billion-dollar deal. The adoption papers were finalized on a bright morning in court. Nathan wore a simple suit, Sophie a dress Josephine had chosen for her, soft blue with a ribbon tied at the back. When the judge asked if he was certain, Nathan's voice did not waver. He said yes with a clarity that surprised even him, as though the choice had been written into him long before. Sophie slipped her hand into his, her grip small but strong, and he knew there was no turning back, nor would he ever want to. Back at the mansion that evening, the three of them shared a quiet meal. No corporate calls interrupted, no unexpected visitors arrived with promises or threats. The house glowed with a kind of peace Nathan had never known. He looked at Sophie's drawings on the wall, Josephine's tired but contented smile across the table, and he realized the truth. Family had not been found in the boardroom or in glittering parties. It had been forged here, through betrayal survived and trust rebuilt, in the steady presence of a child and a caretaker who had stood by him when all the masks fell away. The night was quiet in the mansion, the kind of quiet that felt safe rather than heavy. The clocks ticked steadily, the fire burned low, and Nathan worked at his desk with the soft glow of his lamp spilling over papers and screens. His study no longer felt like a battlefield of secrets. The envelope that had once threatened to ruin him was gone, and in its place sat Sophie's drawings taped proudly to the wall beside his shelves. Crayon suns and stick, figure families stood where shadows of betrayal had once lingered, and every time Nathan looked at them, a calmness settled over him that no contract or deal had ever given him. Sophie padded into the study on bare feet, her hair tangled from sleep, her small arms wrapped around her notebook. She climbed onto the wide chair beside him without a word, curling her legs underneath her. Nathan glanced at her, ready to tell her it was late, but stopped when he saw the steady way she looked at him. She was not afraid of the dark anymore. She was not afraid of being ignored. She was simply here, because this was her home now, and she no longer doubted her place in it. He kept working, jotting notes, reading figures, but he felt her presence beside him like an anchor. The silence stretched comfortably between them, the kind of silence that did not need to be filled. Then she leaned close, her breath brushing his arm, and whispered, "Don't forget your coffee." Nathan froze, and then a laugh slipped from his chest, soft and genuine. It was such a simple thing, such an ordinary reminder, yet it carried more weight than any deal he had ever signed. Because her small voice was the same voice that had warned him about the envelope, the same voice that had tugged at his sleeve when no one else dared to speak. He realized then that he had almost dismissed it, almost ignored the one person who had seen the truth when he was too blinded by trust in the wrong people. That whisper had saved him, not just from financial ruin, but from a life built on illusions. He reached over and ruffled her hair gently, his smile lingering. "I won't forget," he said. Sophie leaned her head against his arm, her eyes fluttering shut, and Nathan felt his heart tighten with something fierce and steady. This was what mattered, not the numbers in his accounts or the headlines in the papers, but the fact that she trusted him enough to sit beside him in the middle of the night and whisper the words that meant he wasn't alone anymore. The mansion that had once felt like a cage of glass and secrets now breathed with warmth. Josephine's laughter filled the mornings, Sophie's footsteps filled the halls, and Nathan finally understood that the fortune he had built was not measured in billions, but in the fragile, powerful bond of a chosen family. And it had all begun with a whisper. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.